Starting with number 16, we've got the keepers of the western door, the Seneca, the Great Lakes gatekeepers who turned the frontier into a grind. Led by notable figures such as Corn Planter and Old Smoke, the Seneca were the largest and westernmost nation within the Iroquois Confederacy, occupying forested territory along the contested Great Lakes and Upper Ohio corridor, where war, trade, and diplomacy constantly collided. By the 1640s and 50s, during what historians call the Beaver Wars, Seneca-led forces pushed west against the Huron Confederacy and the Erie Nation, two powerful French-aligned indigenous rivals in the Great Lakes trade network. By the end of the campaign, the Seneca had permanently banned the Erie faction from the Great Lakes server. By the late 1770s, during the American Revolution, Seneca warriors teamed up with British forces and carried out coordinated frontier raids on American settlements and militia positions across New York and Pennsylvania, enough sustained pressure that, in 1779, the Continental Army responded by launching the Sullivan Expedition, a deliberate scorched earth campaign that burned towns, destroyed crops, and targeted the Seneca war machine at its source. Their playstyle? The Great Lakes gatekeepers, highly skilled in corridor control, full woodland mobility, and zero tolerance for rivals. I rank the Seneca Tier 4 because they were formidable woodland warriors who controlled key corridors, but their influence stayed regionally limited to the Great Lakes region. Before we move on, join the war party, pledge your loyalty, and strike that subscribe button. At number 15, we've got the Chickasaw, defensive tacticians of the Southeast who made the Mississippi frontier a no-easy XP zone. Led by notable figures such as Tishomingo and Piomingo, the Chickasaw held a network of fortified villages across the lower Mississippi frontier, effectively locking down river access and denying easy expansion by anchoring their settlements near critical river-adjacent corridors and leveraging British trade muskets to counter larger forces. In 1736, French forces under Governor Bienville marched into Chickasaw territory expecting a clean victory. Instead, at the fortified village of Acquia, Chickasaw defenders held their strongholds with disciplined musket fire from elevated firing positions behind wooden stockades, by which they repelled repeated assaults and forced a retreat that stalled French expansion in the region. 3 years later, in 1739, the French returned with a larger force, artillery, and allied native contingents, aiming to finish what they started. But once again, Chickasaw fortifications and resistance stalled the campaign, forcing negotiations instead of conquest. Their playstyle? The Tower Defenders, masters of fortified defense, highly skilled in defensive positioning, zero ground given. I rank the Chickasaw Tier 4 because they executed a near-flawless tower defense strategy against European invasions, but they never scaled that power past their own region. At number 14, sailing in from the Pacific Northwest, the Haida, coastal strike specialists who turn Pacific trade routes into contested waters. Led by notable figures such as Koya and Kunea during the 18th and early 19th centuries, the Haida operated from island strongholds off the coast of present-day British Columbia, using long-range canoe fleets carved from massive red cedar logs to conduct raids that shaped trade, power, and regional influence. In 1794, Haida warriors intercepted and captured the American brig Jefferson along the northwest coast, killing several crew members and seizing the vessel after approaching under the guise of trade and then storming the deck. A reminder that Pacific trade routes ran through Haida-controlled waters. By the early 1800s, Haida war canoes were pushing south past Vancouver Island and into the Puget Sound, striking distant shoreline villages and capturing prisoners for enslavement, exchange, or even to trade, before vanishing back north across open water. Their playstyle? The Coastal Raiders, masters of marine mobility, highly skilled in long-range strikes, zero safe harbors. I rank the Haida Tier 4 because they projected maritime power across hundreds of miles of coastline, but their dominance remained confined to the northwest coast. At number 13, we've got the Tlingit, northwest coast tacticians who destroyed a Russian foothold and forced an empire to regroup. Led by notable figures such as Katleon and Chief Shakes during the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the Tlingit fortified cedar plank villages protected by wooden palisades along narrow coastal inlets in southeast Alaska, around modern-day Sitka and Juneau, controlling the water routes that funneled furs from the interior to the sea. In 1802, Tlingit warriors attacked the Russian post at Sitka, armed with trade muskets, hardwood war clubs, and iron-bladed daggers, killing many of its defenders and setting the outpost ablaze, a decisive move that reasserted control over southeast Alaska's coastal choke points, denying Russia a stable spawn point on the coast where every inlet was controlled by local clans. In 1804, Russian Governor Alexander Baranov returned with reinforcements in the warship Neva, bombarding the Tlingit fort at Sitka with ship-mounted cannons and musket volleys in a multi-day battle that forced a strategic Tlingit withdrawal before Russia could finally re-establish its post. Their playstyle? The Inlet Guardians, specialists in strategic coastal positioning, built for siege endurance and zero easy expansion. I rank the Tlingit Tier 4 because they forced an Empire-level rematch and held their ground in a naval siege, but never scaled that resistance into sustained regional dominance. At number 12, riding in from the southwest, the Navajo, masters of canyon warfare who tested Spanish, Mexican, and US expansion and turned the borderlands into a long-term grind. Led by notable figures such as Manuelito and Barboncito from the canyon systems of present-day Arizona and New Mexico, the Navajo leveraged steep-walled mesas, deep canyons, and open desert terrain to their advantage. In 1775, Spanish colonial forces launched a campaign into Navajo territory to suppress raiding along the New Mexico frontier, only to find themselves fighting through maze-like canyon corridors and steep sandstone walls that limited maneuverability, ultimately failing to break Navajo resistance. After Mexico gained independence in 1821, Navajo raiding intensified along the New Mexico frontier. Even throughout the 1830s, Navajo fighters targeted Mexican settlements for sheep and horses, building economic strength through sustained raiding while remaining difficult to decisively engage in open battle. But finally, in the early 1860s, the US Army shifted strategy. Under Kit Carson, troops systematically burned fields, chopped orchards, seized thousands of sheep and horses, and destroyed the Navajos' winter food stores, forcing surrender through sustained resource denial rather than battlefield victory. Their playstyle? The Canyon Phantoms, masters of impossible terrain and highly skilled in hit-and-run tactics. I rank the Navajo Tier 3 because they tested Spanish, Mexican, and US expansion across generations, but their power was mainly in their endurance rather than territorial expansion. At number 11, descending from the Rockies, the Ute, early horse adopters who controlled key passes between the Rockies and the Southwest. Led by notable figures such as Wakara and Coloro, by the 1700s the Ute operated across present-day Colorado and Utah, occupying strategic mountain corridors and high-altitude valleys, moving seasonally between high mountain valleys and open plains to project power across a wide frontier. And that dominance didn't fade with time. In 1853, Ute leader Wakara launched a series of mountain raids on Mormon settlements in Utah Territory, including the likes of modern-day Provo. Local militias responded by fortifying towns and organizing mounted patrols, escalating the conflict into 2 years of armed confrontation. Then in 1879, tensions exploded in Colorado during the Meeker incident when Ute warriors killed Indian agent Nathan Meeker. Amid disputes over federal attempts to force the White River Ute into fixed farming settlements, prompting the U.S. military to deploy troops into northwestern Colorado, resulting in a violent confrontation at Milk Creek, where Ute fighters ambushed a U.S. column, killing its commanding officer, Major Thomas Thornburg, and engaging in days of sustained gunfire before federal reinforcements secured the region. Their playstyle? The Rocky Mountain Cavalry. Max mobility, full mountain pass control, zero safe supply routes. I rank the Ute Tier 3 because they turned elevation and horses into a sustained frontier advantage, but they never expanded beyond the Rocky Mountain corridor. Coming in at number 10, riding north under pressure, the Nez Perce, a nation whose 1877 fighting retreat earned reluctant respect from U.S. commanders. Led by notable figures such as Chief Joseph and Looking Glass from the river valleys of present-day Idaho and eastern Oregon, the Nez Perce maxed out their horse breeding skill set and developed a strong horse culture that asserted their mobility across the region. In 1863, U.S. officials imposed a treaty that dramatically reduced Nez Perce lands and divided the nation between treaty and non-treaty bands. In 1877, federal orders demanding the Nez Perce relocate onto the smaller reservation ignited open war. At Whitebird Canyon, U.S. cavalry underestimated Nez Perce positioning, where Nez Perce warriors outflanked the advancing troops and forced a retreat. Washington responded by dispatching multiple army units to hunt them down. The Nez Perce countered with a disciplined 1,000-mile-plus retreat across Idaho and into Montana, engaging U.S. U.S. forces at Clearwater and later at Big Hole, repeatedly outmaneuvering cavalry columns and implementing clean phased withdrawals, rear guards holding defensible terrain while the main body repositioned. Their playstyle? The Moonwalkers. Endurance maxed, masters of the tactical retreat, and zero reckless last stands. I rank the Nez Perce Tier 3 because their 1877 campaign showcased exceptional discipline under pressure, but ultimately their impact boils down to only one prolonged war. And number 9, spawning in from the northeast woodlands, the Mohawk. Led by notable figures such as King Hendrick and Joseph Brant from the Mohawk River Valley of present-day upstate New York, the Mohawk guarded the eastern flank of the Iroquois Confederacy, controlling key river corridors and often shaved their heads, leaving only a strip of hair down the center, a style that later became known as the Mohawk. By the 1640s, during the early Beaver Wars, Mohawk warriors had secured muskets through Dutch trade at Fort Orange, giving them a battlefield edge over rivals still relying primarily on bows, clubs, and spears. Leveraging these firearms, Mohawk war parties amplified their offensive reach, helping fracture French-aligned powers and tilt the regional trade meta toward the Iroquois. And by 1689, the war reached French doorsteps. Under cover of darkness, Mohawk-led war parties descended on Lachine, a French settlement near Montreal. Homes were burned, settlers captured or killed. The following year, Mohawk and allied war parties launched another surprise strike at Schenectady, overwhelming the sleeping frontier settlement and destroying much of the town before disappearing back into the woodlands. Their playstyle? The Forest Raiders, aggression maxed, early firearm adopters, and masters of forest warfare. I rank the Mohawk Tier 3 because their woodland assault tactics and musket warfare made them a feared offensive force, but their power operated primarily within Confederacy campaigns. And number 8, patrolling the frontier of the Mississippi Valley, the Osage, one of the most dangerous tribes in the Plains server. Led by notable figures such as Iron Shirt, White Hair, and Black Dog, the Osage controlled one of the largest territories in the Central Plains. By the early 1700s, Osage war parties were farming XP and raiding rival tribes across Missouri, Kansas, and Arkansas. Throughout the 1700s, the Osage were locked in a long-running conflict with the Pawnee across the Central Plains. War parties rode hundreds of miles on raiding expeditions, striking rival villages, seizing horses, and disappearing back into open prairie, a brutal frontier grind full of loot for the Osage. By the early 1800s, the Osage were still one of the dominant war powers on the plains, but in 1817, U.S. forces attacked an Osage settlement at Claremore Mound, igniting a brutal frontier battle involving mounted war parties, combining musket volleys with fast cavalry charges that demonstrated that Osage were still capable of delivering dangerous burst damage to anyone entering their territory. Their playstyle? The Lords of the Plains, raid specialists, masters of minimap control, and high scores on the Plains servers. I rank the Osage Tier 2 because they controlled one of the largest territories on the Plains server through sustained raids, but never expanded their dominance beyond the Central Plains map. At number 7, emerging from the swamps of Florida, the Seminole, guerrilla fighters who turned the southeastern frontier into one of the most expensive wars the United States ever fought. Led by notable figures such as Osceola and Wildcat in the early 1800s, the Seminole built settlements across the wetlands, forests, and river systems of present-day Florida. In 1817, tensions along the Florida frontier escalated into what became known as the First Seminole War. Seminole fighters launched raids along the Georgia border, striking isolated settlements before retreating deep into the difficult terrain of forests and swamps where conventional armies struggled to follow. A challenging level full of quick-time event triggers and ambush zones. Then in 1835, the Seminole triggered one of the most famous ambushes in American frontier history. As Major Francis Dade's column of U.S. soldiers marched through central Florida, Seminole fighters waited hidden along the trail. When the signal came, a coordinated barrage of musket fire erupted from the tree line, the opening volley killing Dade himself, a brutal critical hit that deleted most of the Americans' units within minutes and ignited the Second Seminole War. Their playstyle? The Swamp Phantoms, stealth maxed, masters of hit and run warfare, zero predictable engagements. I rank the Seminole Tier 2 because they forced the United States into decades of brutal frontier warfare, but their dominance never extended beyond the Florida server. And number 6, riding out from the northern plains and some of the most feared warriors ever to log onto the server, the Blackfeet. Led by notable figures such as Crowfoot and Mountain Chief from the grasslands and river valleys of present-day Montana and southern Alberta, the Blackfeet built a powerful powerful warrior culture centered on mounted mobility, buffalo hunting, and tightly organized war parties. Throughout the 1700s, they fought long campaigns against Shoshone rivals. In 1806, Lewis and Clark entered Blackfeet territory, revealing plans to arm the Shoshone, causing Blackfeet warriors to attempt to seize the expedition's horses and guns overnight. Lewis and another soldier shot and killed 2 Blackfeet warriors in response, in one of the only deadly clashes of their entire expedition. Later on in 1870, U.S. troops attacked a Blackfeet winter camp in one of the most infamous clashes of the frontier wars. Moving through deep snow before sunrise, soldiers surrounded the camp and unleashed a barrage of rifle fire into the Blackfeet lodges along Marias River, killing nearly 200 Blackfeet, most of them women, children, and elderly, after troops mistook the village for Mountain Chief's hostile war band, who was blamed for earlier attacks on American settlers. Their playstyle? The Northern Plains Enforcers. Masters of mounted warfare, hunting skills maxed. I rank the Blackfeet Tier 2 because they secured huge hunting territories and defended them with fast-moving mounted war parties, but they never expanded their power the way Tier 1 factions did. At number 5, leveling up on the Southern Plains, the Kiowa, elite mounted raiders who turned frontier warfare into a fast-paced PvP game. Led by notable figures such as Satanta and Lone Wolf, the Kiowa operated across the southern plains of present-day Oklahoma and the Texas Panhandle, where warriors known for feathered war bonnets, painted shields, and decorated war horses built a reputation for fast-moving mounted raids. Long before the U.S. Army entered the lobby, Kiowa riders were already farming XP across Texas and northern Mexico along their Comanche allies. But in 1871, Santanta, Satank, and Big Tree had a mounted strike near Salt Creek against a U.S. Army supply convoy known as the Warren Wagon Train. Dozens of Kiowa riders swept in, surrounding the wagons and overwhelming the teamsters, an ambush that ultimately deleted the convoy and sent shockwaves across the frontier. Years later, in 1874, Kiowa, Comanche, and Cheyenne warriors charged the Buffalo Hunter outpost of Adobe Walls in the Texas Panhandle, hoping to wipe out encroaching American hunters who were farming buffalo hides across the plains. But the defenders' long-range rifles landed devastating critical hits from distances the attackers couldn't counter, forcing the war party to withdraw after a fierce fight. Their playstyle? The Buffalo Bullies. Mobility maxed, train hunters, high-value loot collectors. I rank the Kiowa Tier 2 because they were one of the most dangerous mounted raiding forces on the server, but they usually fought alongside Comanche power rather than dominating the server alone. Before we ride into Tier 1, if this warpath has you leaning forward in the saddle, go ahead and hit subscribe. We break down history's deadliest warriors every week. Don't miss the next campaign. At number 4, charging across the northern plains, the Cheyenne, fearsome fighters who built one of the most disciplined war machines on the frontier. Led by notable figures such as Roman Nose, Black Kettle, and Little Wolf, the Cheyenne ranged across the northern plains where warriors recognized for braided hair, painted shields, and powerful warrior societies like the Dog Soldiers built a reputation for disciplined war parties and coordinated plains combat. In 1866, during Red Cloud's War, Cheyenne and Lakota warriors set one of the most devastating traps of the frontier wars. Near Fort Phil Kearny, in present-day Wyoming, a decoy party lured Captain William Fetterman and 80 soldiers over Lodge Trail Ridge. Once the troops crossed the ridge and lost sight of reinforcements, hundreds of Cheyenne and Lakota warriors emerged from the hills and surrounded the column in a sudden ambush, killing all 81 men in minutes. A decisive wipe remembered as the Battle of the Hundred in the Hands. A decade later, in 1876, Cheyenne warriors joined Lakota and Arapaho fighters in one of the frontier wars' most famous clashes. Near the Little Bighorn River in present-day Montana, hundreds of mounted warriors counterattacked George Custer's 7th Cavalry, surrounding and collapsing that isolated battalion in a devastating plains wipe. Their playstyle? The War Engine. Discipline maxed, ambush experts, zero hesitation. I rank the Cheyenne Tier 1 because their war society system produced disciplined fighters capable of overwhelming U.S. troops in large-scale plains battles. And number 3, emerging from the desert fog of war, the Apache, hit-and-run specialists who made the Southwest one of the hardest regions for armies to control. Led by notable figures such as Geronimo, Cochise, and Victorio, the Apache ranged across the deserts and canyonlands where warriors known for long hair, headbands, and light desert gear built a reputation for stealthy raids and elusive elusive guerrilla warfare. In 1861, a meeting between Apache leader Cochise and U.S. Lieutenant George Bascom spiraled into violence after Bascom falsely accused Cochise of kidnapping a settler's son and tried to arrest him during negotiations. Cochise escaped by cutting through the side of a tent, but both sides took hostages and soon executed them, igniting a brutal frontier war that would rage across the Southwest for more than a decade. Just a year later, in 1862, Apache fighters attacked a Union column moving through Apache Pass in present-day Arizona. Warriors fired from cliffs overlooking the narrow pass, pinning soldiers down with accurate rifle fire from concealed positions, a desert sniper advantage that forced the U.S. Army to deploy howitzers to blast the rocky ridges before the troops could push through. By the 1880s, Apache resistance reached its most famous phase under Geronimo. With a small band of fighters moving through the mountains and deserts of Arizona and northern Mexico, he repeatedly slipped through Army patrols and launched sudden raids, forcing the United States to deploy thousands of troops and scouts to hunt fewer than 40 Apache warriors. Their playstyle? The Canyon Hunters, stealth-maxed, ambush experts, total terrain mastery. I rank the Apache Tier 1 because their stealth, mobility, and terrain knowledge forced 3 different empires to spend generations trying to defeat them. At number 2, we've got the Lakota, mounted warriors who turned the Great Plains into one of the most dangerous battlefields in North America. Led by notable figures such as Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, and Red Cloud, the Lakota dominated the plains of present-day South Dakota, Wyoming, and Montana, building one of the most formidable mounted fighting cultures on the frontier. Beyond major battles like the Fetterman Fight and Little Bighorn, Lakota warbands were grinding out victories all over the minimap. In 1854, a dispute over a stray cow near Fort Laramie triggered one of the earliest clashes of the Plains Wars, compelling a young U.S. lieutenant to march 30 soldiers into a Lakota camp to demand justice. Shots rang out. Lakota warriors surged from the surrounding hills and riverbanks, surrounding the detachment and deleting the entire unit in minutes, an early critical hit that put the Plains firmly into PvP mode. A decade later, Lakota resistance escalated into Red Cloud's War. As U.S. forces tried to establish forts along the Bozeman Trail, Lakota and Cheyenne war parties repeatedly ambushed patrols and harassed supply lines, turning the trail into a dangerous PvP corridor. After years of sustained pressure, the United States rage quit the route, abandoning its forts and signing the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie, temporarily conceding the Powder River country to Lakota control, a rare moment where native resistance forced the U.S. Army to retreat. Their playstyle? The Thunder Riders. Cavalry mastery, open plains combat, overwhelming charges. I rank the Lakota number 2 because they achieved something few tribes ever did, forcing the U.S. Army to abandon its forts during Red Cloud's War and destroying Custer's command at Little Bighorn. At number 1 and storming the leaderboard, the Comanche, the apex predators of the plains. Led by notable figures such as Quanah Parker, Buffalo Hump, and Iron Jacket, the Comanche controlled the southern plains of present-day Texas, Oklahoma, and New Mexico. Their warriors were known for riding at full speed while firing arrows and rifles from horseback, a level of horsemanship that terrified frontier armies. By the early 1800s, Comanche warbands were already shaping many of the frontier conflicts mentioned on this list, but in 1840, tensions exploded in San Antonio during what became known as the Council House Fight. Texas officials demanded the return of captives taken in earlier raids, expecting dozens of prisoners to be brought to the negotiation. When the Comanche arrived with only 1 prisoner, Texas authorities attempted to seize their visiting chiefs as hostages. Knives flashed and pistols fired inside the crowded council house as fighting spilled into the surrounding streets. When the dust settled, several Comanche leaders lay dead, ultimately igniting one of the biggest retaliatory raids in frontier history. Months later, Comanche warbands launched what became known as the Great Raid of 1840. Hundreds of mounted warriors surged across the Texas frontier. Settlements were hit in rapid succession as defenders were cut down, livestock seized, and women and children taken captive before the raiders galloped onward. The war party eventually reached the coastal trading port of Linville, one of the busiest commercial towns on the Texas coast. Comanche riders overran the small defenses, warehouses were looted, and much of the town burned before the raiders withdrew inland, a devastating high-score raid. Their playstyle? The Horse Lords, mobility maxed, long-range raids, total battlefield control. I rank the Comanche number 1 because no other tribe on this list matched their combination of scale, reach, and longevity. They carved out Comancheria, dominated the plains for nearly 2 centuries, burned Linville in 1840, and forced Spain, Mexico, the Republic of Texas, and the United States to fight them across 4 different political eras. And those were the 16 deadliest Native American tribes in history, from the forest ambushes of the Mohawk to the desert ghost warfare of the Apache, and all the way to the thunder of Comanche warbands across the plains. These nations didn't just fight battles, they reshaped entire regions of North America through mobility, strategy, and relentless warfare. But history debates never really end, so now the question goes to you. Which tribe do you think should rank higher on this list? Did we miss a warrior nation that deserved a spot on the leaderboard? Drop your thoughts in the comments and choose your character.